If we're going to talk about the federal funds rate and the federal funds market, exactly how it works and how the Fed can shift it using their tools, I'm going to walk you guys through the types of graphs that we're going to be doing and working with. So here's an example of a general good graph. It could be any good. Let's say for the sake of this example, it's used cars. Just randomly thought of that. But the shifts in these markets work parallel to each other, right? Demand for used cars increases, price is going to increase, like this. So will quantity. That's just how shifters in this market or in these graphs kind of work, right? Demand increased, so this increases as well. The federal funds market is slightly different. It's not the market for a good, it's the market for loanable funds. That's a bad line. Probably wondering what the difference is. It's really no huge difference. Instead of price on the y-axis, we're going to have interest rates. But for this sake, it's going to be the federal funds rate. So remember, this is a graph for the federal funds market. And who are the participators in this market? Well, just banks. Remember, the federal funds rate is the rate at which banks exchange excess funds to each other overnight. Part of a bank's kind of regulations is the reserve ratio. The reserve ratio is just the amount of excess cash banks have to hold in reserves. That's pure cash, pure liquid. They can't just be loaning out all of it for solvency issues. Right, so knowing that the banks are the only people in this market that are participating, I want you to think about supply as savers and demand as borrowers. Who is supplying loanable funds in the federal funds market? Well, it is banks, but it's the banks that are willing to save. So they're willing to loan out more to other people to receive more later. Vice versa to demand. And borrowers, still banks, but it's the banks who need those extra reserves to meet their reserve ratio. They're demanding a little bit more extra funds and they'll pay back more later. This also operates at equilibrium, which means if I need to go get a loan in this market, I can go find one, no problem. Remember, the Fed has a lot of different tools that can affect this. Open market operations, adjusting the discount rate, or changing the reserve ratio. Now the thing is the Fed definitely intentionally switches things in this market to where they can influence the federal funds rate, but there's also something known as an organic example, where things just change, they shift, and the Fed has no intention of doing so. Say housing loans become very profitable. Now what does this mean for this market? Well, banks give out a bunch of different loans, but this specific market is the federal funds market for loans. If housing loans become very profitable, why would I want to be supplying in the federal funds market if I can just go to the housing market and supply there? So supply shifts left, it decreases. Well, demand is going to increase in this market on top of that, because demand didn't really change because of housing loans being profitable. Now, if anything, banks really want these extra funds so that they can go and give out these profitable loans in the housing market. So demand increases too. We don't really know what happens to quantity. If demand were to shift very far, then yeah, quantity would increase, but if it didn't shift very much, quantity would decrease. So we just don't really know what happened to it. But we can clearly see here, this gap in interest rates, it increased a lot. And if you remember what I was mentioning earlier about the relationship between prices and interest rates, when interest rates increase, prices decrease. It's an inverse relationship. Same goes for this, right? So even though this isn't price up here in the federal funds on the y-axis, we still know the relationship of what's happening in price here. If interest rates are going to increase, price is going to decrease. All right, let's go to some of our specific examples, and the Fed actually targets a specific federal funds rate range. By the way, I've been saying range and not actually targeting a federal funds rate because the Fed can't just set a federal funds rate and then that's the rate. They influence it through a multitude of different factors to a point where banks decide to start charging around that same rate What I mean by this is the banks have discretion to set the federal funds rate to whatever they want. If they want to lend out rates at 10%, they can. They're just not going to do so because of profitability's sake. They usually listen to what the Fed has to say. Um, so let's go through the example of a discount rate and how that affects and sets the federal funds rate as kind of a floor. Now, the discount rate is interesting because it is a rate at which banks can borrow from the Fed instead of borrowing from other banks. Remember, borrowers is the demand side, right? These are borrowers. So let's go through an example where the federal funds rate equals, I don't know, 5%. The discount rate is 5.5%, slightly higher. If you're borrowing money, you're just going to want a lower interest rate. You're going to want to pay less money to the people you're borrowing. That just makes sense. So in this example, you're going to choose the 5 or the 5.5%. You can choose the 5. So banks are going to borrow from other banks instead of from the Fed at the discount rate of 5.5%. So even if the Fed increases this discount rate to 6%, nothing's going to happen. Banks are still going to borrow at the 5% rate over here instead of this 6% rate. Nobody's going to want to do that. The interesting thing happens is when the Fed pushes the discount rates below the federal funds rate. So say the federal funds rate is 5% still, but now the discount rate decreases to 4%. See, now it's interesting, right? Because now instead of borrowing at that 5% rate, banks are going to borrow from the Fed at 4%. Right? That makes more sense. But this is where it gets really interesting is that the fact is when you borrow from the Fed, you're not borrowing money in circulation that the other banks are lending you. You're borrowing new money. So the supply of loanable funds that are available in this federal funds market is going to increase because these banks that are borrowing from the Fed are getting brand new money. They now have extra reserves. So the demand is going to decrease too because less people are going to be needing to borrow from these other banks. They're just going to borrow from the Fed. And what happens is the federal funds rate, this interest rate, is going to decrease to a point to where it equals a discount rate of 4% or lower. That's just how it adjusts for itself. And that's why the discount rate is interesting because it only ever affects the market when it's below the federal funds rate. Go through another tool example. This time, the reserve ratio. Let's draw this graph real quick. Alright, so this is how the reserve rate, or the reserve ratio, that's so bad, can affect the supply of money in the market. So let's say the Fed is targeting a higher federal funds rate. That's their target. Well, they can do so by increasing the reserve ratio. Let's think about this for a sec before we graphically depict it. The federal funds market is where banks are looking to borrow excess funds to meet the reserve ratio. So let's say right now the reserve ratio equals 4%, but then the Fed increases it to 6%. Some of these banks are going to operate almost exactly at 4%. But what happens when this increases to 6% is the demand for banks trying to loan or trying to get these loanable funds out in this market is going to increase because now they have to reach this 6% goal. So demand is going to increase. And some of the suppliers, they're not going to have enough to loan out to these other banks that need it anymore because now they also have to meet this 6% increase in reserve rate. So that target of an increased federal funds rate is going to happen. That's what happens here. That's what we're seeing in this graph right over there. Supply is going to shift left, less people are going to be able to loan out. And demand is going to shift right, more people are going to need loans. That's how the Fed can impact and influence the federal funds rate through the reserve rate. Same goes for the opposite. They want to target a decrease in the federal funds rate. All they have to do is decrease the reserve ratio because now more funds are going to be available to loan out. So supply shifts right, unless people are going to be needing these funds to meet the reserve rate because it's just decreased. Alright, the last tool that we're going to be discussing that the Fed can use to affect the federal funds rate is printing money and open market operations. So we know the Fed prints money. And the question is how they get it out there. They do so through open market operations. What this means, and is dealt with, by the way, by the Federal Open Market Committee, kind of makes sense, but it's kind of the place where the Fed goes to buy and sell bonds through auctions. The specific details on that doesn't really matter, but you should just know it's how they buy and sell bonds to influence the supply of money in the economy. So let's say the Fed is targeting a lower federal funds rate. And they want to do so by, I don't know, increasing the money supply, stimulating the economy. So if they want to increase their money supply, well, that means they need to buy bonds, right? So when they buy bonds in these auctions, it means they're giving out the money to the economy and taking the bonds into themselves, stimulating the economy and increasing the money supply. So supply is going to shift left in this market because more people are going to have money, more banks specifically are going to have money to loan out their excess funds. Demand's going to shift left because less of them need to loan out their excess funds or to actually loan to get these funds, is what I mean. So just like this example is insinuating, federal funds rate decreases. Exactly the goal of the Fed, and that's what happens. But more interesting is when the Fed decides that they want to increase the federal funds rate, so they decrease the money supply. So the Fed wants to increase the federal funds rate instead of decreasing it. They do the opposite. Instead of buying bonds, they sell them. Because when you sell the bond, you are giving the person that you're selling it the bond to, the bond, the piece of paper, the contract, worth only what it says, and you're receiving the money in exchange. So when the Fed wants to decrease the money supply, they sell bonds. The money supply goes down, the federal funds rate tends to go up. As we'll see, this makes sense because the money supply decreases. Well, less people are going to have the money to supply funds in the federal funds market, and more people are going to be demanding it because their supply of money just decreased. So we can see here, this pushes interest rates or the federal funds rate up. Again, exactly what the Fed wanted to do. So these three ways are the three main ways that the Fed can influence the federal funds rate. This is a very brief overall description of how they do it, but it is true and it still works in today's economy. And this federal funds rate, the effects that the Fed does on these tools and how it has on the federal funds rate is insurmountable. The federal funds rate, like I discussed earlier, is really the base rate for all other interest rates in the economy. So when the Fed says that they're going to decrease the money supply in order to increase the federal funds rate, this is a big deal. The second that you see this happen, you should bring it to the fund's attention so that we can discuss the impacts this could have on our valuations and other assets like bonds and fixed income. So this is kind of why I wanted to go over these three tools and how they affect the federal funds market as a whole.